Hi, good afternoon, good morning to some of you. We are here for another session, which is very interesting podcast session we have. And our earlier session were more about people, how we can integrate, how people integration will happen, how we can really create synergy between it. Today we have very interesting topic where we are going to focus more on M&A integration through a startup. So how we can integrate a startup, a small firm, and then we make integration as a success. So we have very good speaker here, lots of experience about how to integrate a smaller company into large companies. We have Olivier here, and I would like Olivier to give some background about his profile. And then I have very interesting line of questions, which we are going to ask. Olivier.
Right. Thank you, Singh, first for giving me the opportunity to sharing with you and the audience on this particular very hot topic. Shortly speaking, I will try and introduce myself and to put this in perspective. I've been working now for about 25 years in the M&A environment. I've been a partner in the Big Four environment and joined Alvarez Marsal, where I have some core responsibilities and a managing director with large corporates, and more particularly in the context of post-merger integration. Over the last 5-10 years, needless to say that the startup and disruptive innovation has been a hot topic for the large corporation, and the integration and all different collaborative models for the startup has been one of the top priority and where we've been asked to assist. And that's the reason why we have this podcast today.
Thank you. Thanks for your introduction, Olivier. So I think I have very first question, and I wanted to know from you, why big company go for acquiring a startup? What is the rationale behind, such small acquisitions?
Yeah, I think first comment I would say is that this phenomenon of acquiring startup companies, and when we're talking about startup companies, we're talking about very different size and mostly a couple of industries which are mostly with what we call advanced industries with a high level of R&D and innovation. We may have some seed capital, seed companies and series A, B, and C with different maturities. And Series S, for instance, its valuation between $15 and $20 billion. But the very reason behind large companies being interested in startup companies is first thing first. These large organizations are initially not built to run this kind of fast-paced kind of innovation, and they're more in a position to drive and to deal with repeatable business. When disruptive innovation is much more about what's going to be next, do we understand the marketplace, and how do we deal with both phenomenon? It was the acceleration of technologies, but also the convergence of technologies, the combination of different technologies that you can see, for instance, the pharmaceutical industries. So how do you capture that on due time with the right people to make sure that you address the marketplace and face the competition in the right place? And that's the thing, I think, which is really important. And when you think twice about it, if you look at the Fortune 100 companies, most of them, we say about 80%, of today's a corporate venture capital kind of organization to drive this activity. So I think the startups allow these large companies to challenge themselves and to accelerate existing capabilities, especially in the R&D or in the labs, or to build up existing technology assets. So it's an enabler, not only internally, but also give them the ability to try and capture opportunities in the marketplace, which is difficult to replicate. And over the last 5-10 years, this has been one of the top priority. Whatever the industries and whatever the geographies, it's a very high kind of top strategic priorities for the clients we've been working for over the last 10 years.
Right. So primarily, I think, as you rightly said, that most of the big company, for them, these acquisition targets are primarily to accelerate the development activity, accelerate the market shares, right? So that is what is the main focus.
Absolutely. Just how we capitalize on a more entrepreneurial kind of spirit.
Right.
Obviously, Tyre attract very high level of talent. Of course, you have to do your own due diligence, and we'll get back to that, I think, later on. But it's an acceleration, and obviously it needs to be in line with the corporate strategy, one of the business unit or different market segments. But I think it's just capturing the best of the best, I would say, kind of process and ideas, and make sure that it works in your environment. But this also definitely give rise to a lot of challenges.
Yeah, so I think my next question is just related to this one. I think you already gave some pointers, but I wanted to know more about what are the deal criteria for, when a big company go for a startup acquisitions. What are the deal criteria they fix?
Yeah, you could have obviously different one, but I think most of them could be fourfold. First thing first, there must be an internal kind of work to make sure that what you're looking for in terms of startups or technology or talent really matches or meshes with your own strategy. Where do you want to be? Why do you want to be? What kind of market do you want to address? What are the key risks in relation to this technology or process? So first thing first, I think working with a startup or making an acquisition of a startup might be consistent with your tactic and strategy, which is absolutely very important. You would be amazed how many times, because there must be what we call a hubris from the board management, there's a disconnect between the opportunity to take a startup and the real rationale behind activating this kind of process. The second point, I think one of the main criterion is the management quality in terms of talent, leadership, ability to drive this kind of R&D or understanding this kind of process. The third one is the robustness of, because most startups are dealing with technology, the robustness of your technology, the robustness of the software, and we get back to that. That's one of the key risks in relation to startup acquisition for the large companies, because they don't have all the structure or the environment. And then last but not least, what are the key risks when it comes to a startup? It's not only the talent retention, technology robustness, but it's also legal in terms of IP, in terms of content, in terms of patent, in terms of, depending on where you are, is it a US-based company or a European-based company or UK or Asia, you will have to appreciate and assess the risk in this relation. So you will be a strategic, talent, technology and risk mainly kind of process to appraise, I would say, in terms of criteria.
Yeah. So, I have seen most of big company now, they have their own ventures and they, try to fund the startup, try to groom them over time before they decide to either partner with them and go for acquisition. So in your opinion, what could be vehicle companies, large company are using to, attract those startup company, groom them slowly? What are different things you think you have seen what large company are doing now?
Yeah, there are. I think the large companies, the large goals, very large, depending on the industry, have different challenges to deal with, and depending on where they want to be and the maturity of the technology or the perspective, they may have different tools or vehicles to activate. The acquisition is more a conviction that it might trigger values within the organization, either to accelerate or to complement an R&D. But you have plenty of different schemes you can deal with, like implementing digital labs or to make in place what we call accelerators or incubators to make sure that you help the company to also cash in on their views, their technology, their innovation, and the way they want to tackle the market. As I said earlier on, you also have a lot of corporate venture vehicle with different models. Sometimes you have internal, sometimes you have partnerships. In the aerospace and defense, we can see that some of the key players have put in place this kind of organization extremely well connected with 10,000s of different startups all over the world, not only in the US, but also in Europe or in Asia. Bearing in mind that when in some industry, both the US and Israel account for a big part of startups and innovation in different areas. But there's a lot of schemes. You could have different partnerships, contract partnerships. The collaboration model is very various, and really depending on the maturity and the risks as well. Because making an acquisition is fraught with a lot of risk. You might be more interested in putting into this kind of environment.
Yeah. So we have seen several, we have run several, due diligence for large acquisitions. In your opinion, how critical this is for the startup company?
But I think the due diligence kind of exercise is first thing first. It's getting more and more normalized when it comes to a certain size of business. But when it comes to a startup, and depending on first the segment we're talking about, the size and the maturity, obviously the financials might be that relevant. You'd be more willing to appreciate, I would say, the business plan. The cash burn as well. How much cash do you need, and what kind of process you want to deal with? The legal due diligence will be very important, based on the geographies. We talked about the IP, the patent. In some areas, an employee might be the owner of the IP. In some others, it will be the legal entity. But also, last but not least, because this is mainly driven by technology, is the robustness of the technology. I've been in different situations where big companies made an acquisition of a startup, but with very low kind of level of cybersecurity issues. And that's one of the key critical one, because it does mean that these companies need to learn how to appreciate the robustness, the maintainability of the code, test coverage, the infrastructure, the technology roadmap. And this I need when you talk to clients, companies requires additional skills or understanding of what does it mean when you develop a code, especially if you have short or medium-term views on how you want to capitalize this with different business units. So I would say legal, technology, business plan are the key kind of due diligence. Needs to be adapted to the very context. It can't be the same than for a large company, which is more structured. With more financial available information over the last 3 years, for instance. These would be the top key topics to be dealt with.
Yeah. So what will be the expectation of a smaller, startup company when they got acquired and joining the large corporate?
I think when you start a kind of discussions first with a large company, I think now there's a maturity around who would be the best host for my company, for my colleagues, because there's a strong kind of relationship and there's a trust around the leadership team. So some of them very picky when it comes to see what the best partner, not only for a commercial perspective, but also for your team, and to make sure that the DNA or the way of working will not be wiped out all of a sudden in a very complex kind of organization. So I think of course, the market, the capability to be at scale will be definitely important, but it will be also very critical to be very clear on how you're going to welcome people. What does it mean for them in terms of way of working, in terms of career, in terms of budget, in terms of cooperation as well with the rest of the companies, and how you can, I would say, leverage your knowledge in terms of marketing, sales, access to the market. So it's kind of a combination of technical, sales, and people centered kind of a challenge that I think they're looking for to make a long story short.
So we spoke about how these big companies, what are the expectations from a startup company when they join the large organization. What will be the level of complexity between a startup, if you compare a startup integration to large company and vice versa?
I'm here. Sorry, let me cut.
So my question was more, what are the level of complexity between a startup integration and large company integration?
I think the kind of complexity is born by the fact that we're talking about very different organization. We're talking about very different corporate culture traits as well. We're talking about very different ways of making business. The fact that as well, there's not one fit for purpose integration model for a startup, and we will get back to that later on, I think, Singh. It's also making sure that you can retain talent. Notion of what we call acquire hire kind of approach is very key. Most of the time, the startup is based on a couple of individuals. But you also have the complexities is born from internally. Do we have the buy-in from the R&D team or the business units, or do we have a strong sponsorship to go ahead? It's not. It's a two-way street, I would say, that you absolutely need to be dealt with at the very inception of the process. And to make sure that you have a story, you have a robust story for the startup, and make sure that the cross-pollination, so to speak, the synergies will be there at some point. Yeah. If I may summarize this way.
Yeah. And what are the key risks and challenges while you are going and integrating a startup? In your view, I think you can give some example of your past experience.
As we said, I would say first thing first is talent retention. And this might be mitigated by a very clear, honest, and early discussions with the top management or the leadership and management of the startup to very understand what are the key expectations, how they work, the rationale behind the projects, and to make sure that they will be there and very willing to make this happen, because it really depends on that. The second point, I would say, making sure that you don't lose the agility and the way of working, the DNA of the startup. And this will definitely rely on how good you are to instill a buy-in internally, to make sure that there will be at some point a collaboration between these people and the organization in place. Do we have a conviction that there's something to do together, and how do we want to do it together? Making an acquisition could be on the paper, but when it comes to reality, to make sure that it works. So it's a long process to prepare, to make sure that you involve the right people at the beginning, and that there's no misunderstanding on, or we should be able to do that internally versus these guys are the best or have developed a strong knowledge, and we could definitely have an exponential growth if we apply the technology or part of the process in our business unit or R&D. So talent retention, internal buy-in, making sure that the integration model doesn't destroy, so to speak, the spirit, the entrepreneurial and the way of working, which is always tricky. It's not
not easy.
And the technology as well, which is always fraught with a lot of risks. Cyber, we mentioned earlier on, are the key topics I would say that I've seen on the marketplace.
So, I think you spoke about integration for a startup. So is there a strategy which fits all type of integration for a startup, or you have a separate integration strategy for a startup and for others?
Yeah, I would say so, because first thing first is, what's the rationale behind the acquisition? Is it a new business, or is it a business that exists that we want to complement? How strong is the startup on the marketplace? If it's a Series A, B, or C, a different maturity, did they come up with a new concept? And how strong is the brand on the marketplace? And depending on that, you might be in a position to try and draw an integration model which will dictate whether the startup will be hosted within an existing business unit, will be a separated business, or will be hosting part of the acquirer business. This is really important, because I do think, and my experience indicates, that this kind of discussion, the integration model, really will drive the success of it. And as long as it is clear internally and with the acquired companies, will definitely make sense, commercially speaking, technologically speaking, and when it comes to people, to explain why we do that, what does it mean, and how we're going to work together. So internal, external kind of model, do we need a BU or legal entity? Who do we need to work with? Is there only a process-driven or organization? This is always a very specific situation, but we can see these kind of four models on the marketplace, and more particularly in the technology areas.
Right. So while once you decide to integrate a startup, what are the key steps which are critical for a startup company for integration?
I would say, for me, integration should start at the very beginning of the acquisition process, much more before the signing or, of course, the close. So I would even say that at some points, the integration topic could be a deal breaker. But we know that at some point the deal goes first, and depending on how many startups you have in the marketplace as well, sometimes you don't have the choice but just to go because you have a pressure from the organization. I would say first thing first, the first step for me is, as we said earlier on, make sure that this acquisition makes sense from a strategic standpoint. There's no worse situation where you make an acquisition, do not deliver any synergies, losing talent, and there's a reputation risk as well. So there must be kind of a consistency, very strict kind of process in terms of technology, roadmap, markets, competencies that needs to be driven. The second point I would say is, of course, you are a large, mostly listed company, so you need to abide by some of the laws. And when you welcome some risks, you need to report, make sure you have mitigation plans. So defining and discussing around what must be the must-haves with the startup is important. And we see most of the time that large company make a mistake, which consists in, okay, this is the reporting book, which is a 500-page document in English, complex, with ERP and other processes where there's no adherence to that. So make sure that the must-haves are well understood, that you provide on-site support, HR, financial, legal, internal audit, very important, because you're going to start as well to liaise with these people and to bridge the gap between the corporate and the startup. I would also say co-developing a tailor-to-need integration model is important. Do it together. Of course, you will have your idea, but try and develop together something, make sure that they're happy with that. It does make sense. There's a very good understanding. Last but not, it's not the last one, but I think in terms of enabler, you need to have someone, a champion or someone who knows the acquirer very well to help either the leadership at least to navigate or to quickly fix some situation in terms of resources, in terms of budget, in terms of process. Very, very important. And large organizations who spend time on picking these people up. They are very specific DNA. They need to be very excited by that. Retaining the leadership team, we already talked about that, but this is very important. So it's not necessarily a money kind of issue, it's the organization chart, the role as well. And you need to discuss internally sometimes to make sure that there's a consensus over what will become the leadership team within the organization. Secure your closing. We talked about the technology risks, but that's a situation I've seen several times where you make an acquisition and it looks like the software is very weak in terms of protection, and it could result in a very bad situation when you've been hacked and you just try and fix it, but will never deliver any synergies. Focus on value creation as well. It's obvious, but make sure that the reason behind that is with a financial plan, makes sense on the market side and based on different discussions. Try and foster collaboration. The champion which should help. Make sure that there's a good dialogue, understanding of what we're expecting, as we said, how we want to work, what are the key top programs, how we could cooperate together. And we also help the startup cash in on all the marketing, sales, and to be at scale. And last but not least, and it will depend, of course, on the investment thesis, to make sure that the startup team feels well within the new organization, and how to make sure that they're not completely lost, they've not lost the decision-making process, still have agility. So these would be, I would say, the top key priority to engage with the startups in the context of an acquisition.
So maybe you can give some of the pointers for audience, some of the key lessons learned in relation to a startup integration, most important key success factors, which people, our audience can really use them.
I think you have, with startups, you have common lessons learned that you could have with any other organization, and you have specific ones. I think the first one, which is always the same, is always start the process with the end state in mind. Why do you want to make this acquisition? Does it make sense from a technology roadmap kind of approach? Does it make sense from a strategic point? Do we have competitors? Are we at risk in terms of technology side? So why? The why and why, very important. And then the integration will be a consequence on where you want to be. Second point, I would say, make sure that you secure at board level a real sponsorship. Because it might not be an easy story, but you still need to have someone who will be a decision maker in a position to move the needle if needed and to make the right decisions. The third one we already mentioned is to ensure that you have an internal buy-in, discussions, a dialogue, either with the R&D team members or the sales or the leadership or a business unit or a segment within the organization. Does it make sense? Are we in a position to deliver synergies or to come up with a brand new concept in what short period of time, etc. Make sure as well that you're in a position to measure collaboration with or without KPIs. It's important to make sure that you just don't make an acquisition and let things drift. We need to make sure that in terms of moral, in terms of progress, in terms of how do we, what's the acquisition change in our programs? What did we benefit is very important. So a timely kind of dialogue is really important, not only on fixing things, making sure that the initial view results in concrete kind of steps and actions, commercial, technological, organization. This is really, really important. And that's where I think the champion as well has a role to play in helping the dialogue and making sure that it's going on the right path. One of the key challenges, and I think we mentioned it earlier on when you asked me the question about why do large companies make such acquisitions, and I think they always, some of them honestly want to try and capture what this entrepreneurial kind of spirit means. We know multi-billion-dollar company with very strict processes, ERP-enabled organization, shared services, and monsters, difficult to be dealt with. And I think they have a strong appetite now because of the acceleration of technology and the convergent technology. Say, could we be, you've never seen, we never talked so much about agility, agile kind of program. We can't afford them to be too long. So we try to make it in a secure environment, very quickly go to market. And if you see companies like Cisco, for instance, have an integration kind of process with a go-to-market driven, if they have a very clear acquisition for the startup. As we said, one of the key lessons learned, do not underestimate the allocation of a champion, someone who knows the organization, who is respected, who has communication skills, understands the startup ecosystem and kind of mindset, super important. Create as well for the startup a single point of contact, make sure that they're not lost within the very organization, because they will need to understand what do I need to do, how do I work, who I rely on, I need this kind of information, how do I do that? I would like to have some legal advice. Can I do this? Who should I talk to when it comes to marketing? What kind of platform should we develop? Very, very, very critical. Never let the startup alone. And that's the very beginning of a bad story with people, retention, for instance. And again, I think it's simple things. So to speak, integration sometimes is complex, but realize a very simple thing. It's just making sure that you have an ongoing dialogue, communication, try and go tomorrow. What has changed? What could be improved? Again, there's no one fits all integration model. There's not one recipe to do that. And I think both, and mostly large company should show some kind of humility. And it's you're learning by doing, and the more the better, originally speaking. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a lot of acquisition, 4 or 5 during a year, but it's always the same, not necessarily aligned with the strategy, no synergy delivery, losing a lot of talent, and billions lost, so to speak. So
that's focus.
Would be these ones in a summary, I would say, when it comes to startup acquisition and integration.
Right, right. I think these are very important points, and surely there are lots of takeaway from this session. Also, while we were talking about, when a startup get acquired, come to the big company, and your landing organization, they land somewhere, and then if they are not sure what is the vision, because the startup company have to make sure that they drive the vision in the larger picture, larger preview of the company when they get acquired. So it is critical for retaining those talents, retaining the leadership team, so they drive it and make sure that value delivery happens. So it's very important. Okay, so I have another related questions, maybe not very different one, but I have like, what should be, if you are not doing any startup acquisition, what is alternative? Or instead of a startup, what you do?
I think there are different models, and it really depends on what an organization is looking for. Do you have the convictions that you need to be on one particular market in the forthcoming months or in 2 years' time? Because that's the thing. We all know about the NFT, the blockchain advance, the artificial intelligence, the deep learning, the machine. Every single day, all these technology are evolving, getting more complex. They address regulatory issues and challenges as well. But with huge potential. If you look at the space tech as well, the potential is immense, and these will definitely be very attractive for some companies. You are in or you're out, and that's always one of the key risks is when should you go with a startup, why should you go with the startup, and how should you go with the startup. So you have very different, depending on what's the goal. You could just have a light kind of one-off events with some of the startup talent people, just to have some open discussions. And in the context of hackathons, for instance, you could have some kind of resource sharing to make some kind of cross-pollination in terms of process, and not necessarily about the outcome, but how do you tackle a particular problem? And that's very, very important, I think, in the scientist brain. It could be incubators or accelerators programs, business support for a startup that large company could really capitalize on. That's another kind of alternative to a startup. Partnerships, of course, contracts, JV. It's more for problem-solving kind of issues. You not necessarily want to address a new market, but at some point, a large company might be stuck in solving a problem to make sure that the overall technology works. And there's a startup with a niche, with a particular competency, which will be in the much better position to help you solve the problem. Of course, you could have, we mentioned that before, a more investment kind of approach throughout a corporate venture vehicle. It would be a minority investment. But at that stage, it means that the companies that I've been working with have already defined, let's say, 5, 10, 15, 20 very specific segments that they're interested in their technology roadmap or in strategy roadmap over the next 5, 10 years. Of course, we all know about the ESG, the carbon-free, all these things that will definitely come into force very quickly if you want to be in the business. And they try to find any solutions in terms of battery, in terms of components, in terms of everything that makes sense when it comes to be compliant, lighter, greener, so to speak, just to give you an example. Last but not least, that's the acquire hiring, which is about how do we acquire talent. But these are gradually, I would say, from the very early collaboration, just sharing information throughout investment and acquisition. You have plenty of different models. It really depends on the, I would say, urgency and criticality in terms of strategy that you want to address as a corporation. And this highlights the need for large corporation to welcome internally people able to gauge or to understand this very complex and fast evolving kind of market, because you have lots of companies, a lot are failed. They don't address the right market, or they don't have the right technology. Some of them become unicorn. We've never seen so many unicorn, maybe 1,000 around the world. So they have lots of opportunities, and there are lots of risk and failure. That's a rule of the game, I would say. But internally, I think it's an ongoing process, a continuing process to appraise, to get closer to this business, to this mindset, to be very well connected, but to understand as well mostly what the key technologies challenges will be in terms of regulatory, in terms of feasibility and market. And that's why I think large corporations, just to open the debate, are very encouraged as well to get closer to CVC, to hedge funds, to capital investors, to understand how they target, how they understand, and how they make sure that and help these companies to succeed. Because it's a real business, it's a real know-how, so to speak. That there's not, it's very different from traditional M&A, I would say.
Yeah, so very interesting. I think Olivier, lots of input you have given. I'm sure that our audience will really like this, because there are lots of key takeaway. If I can summarize, I know in another session we need, especially for a startup acquisition, through your whatever experience you had and you shared with us. I think this is very interesting. So we thank you for your time, and we look forward to hear you again in another episode. Thank you, audience, for listening us. Hope this event was very helpful for you. Feel free to reach out to us if you need any further information, and myself and Olivier will be happy to share those information with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier.
Thanks, Olivier.
Opportunity. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.